Welcome to math class. We are continuing on chapter 2 in the MathWorks 10 workbook. We are going to be continuing with section 2.1, wages and salaries. We're going to be covering part 2, which is mostly overtime pay. And we spent the last class looking at gross pay and how to calculate total hours and that kind of thing. Now we're going to be looking at how overtime can affect your paycheck. So if you are following along in the book, go ahead and open up to page 83. There's an example there of Marcel, who works for a construction company. So for Marcel, he gets paid time and a half for any hours he works over 37 and a half hours in a week. So if he works 42 and a quarter hours during 1 week, how much is he going to earn? There are two kinds of ways to solve this question. They both involve the same sort of method, but what we're going to do is, the first thing we're going to do is convert things to decimals. So 37 and 1/2 we know that is the same as 37.15, and 42 and a quarter is the same as 42.25. So we converted just decimals just to make our numbers a little bit easier to work with, and so we can use calculators and still keep it pretty simple. So time and a half over 37 and a half hours. So the first thing we want to do is we want to figure out how many hours is he working overtime. So I'm going to start with 42.25 minus 37.5, and I'm actually going to wind up with 4.75 hours. Oops, delete that. So now that we know how many hours he's worked, we've got a choice to make. We can either change his wage or we can change the hours. So one of the things to remember is that whenever they start talking about the phrase time and a half, we have to convert that into math numbers that we can work with for math class. So we're actually going to convert that into a decimal. So time in 1/2 is the same as saying 1.5 times. So we have 1 time plus 1/2 of a time. Now we're going to take this number and we're going to multiply it by, and you have a choice here, either your overtime hours or your overtime wage. We are going to multiply the wage. So we're going to figure out his wage, 15.82 hours times 1.5 gives us $23.73. So for those 4.75 hours that Marcel was working, instead of his normal $15.82, he's actually making $23.73 for every hour of work. Now we take that number and, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. We're simply going to take that and multiply it by the number of overtime hours he worked. So 23.73 times 4.75, and we wind up with a total of 112.72. Now this number is his overtime pay. This is not the total amount of pay that he is going to be bringing in that week. Ooh, went too far. For that, we have to actually do another step. I hate when it does this. So we're going to pull this down and get out of the way. So I know that that's his overtime hours, but what about the 37.5 hours of regular pay? Well, we're going to multiply those by his regular wage. And we know that he winds up with $593.25. In order to figure out the total that he's going to earn this week, we have to combine both of those numbers. So we get 593.25 plus 112.72, which gives us our final answer of $705.97. Final answer right there. So if we look back at it, we've got a few steps that we want to deal with. The first step is always, whenever we're dealing with word problems, we need to figure out what are the numbers that we are working with. So we start with the numbers. We have 15.82. We know he's working 37.5 hours. Or sorry, everything over 37.5 hours is time and a half, and he's got 42.25 total hours. So we figure out how many overtime hours he has. We find out what his overtime wage is. We multiply his overtime wage by his overtime hours to get how much money he makes during overtime. Then we add up his regular working hours. So we calculate out his total for his regular working hours. Then we add the two of those together and we wind up with a total. So if we move on to the example on page 84, let me move this out of the way as well a little bit. We have an example of Pete. Right. So Pete is a grader operator working in a road construction crew. So when they're busy, he works time and a half for Monday to Friday overtime hours, and if he has to work on Saturday, he works double time and a half. So just as a quick sort of setup for you, we're going to figure out what all these different numbers mean. All right, so we know that he is working 40 hours of regular time. He's working 5.25 hours of overtime. We know this because he's working 45.25 hours during the week. So we minus 40 regular hours. We're left over with 5.25 hours. And he also has 5.75 hours of double overtime. What does time and a half mean in number form? Time and a half is the same as 1.5, and double time and a half is not 3. It's not double your time and a half. What time and a half actually means is double your regular rate plus a half. Okay, so double time and a half actually is 2.5. So now what we've got to do, and I'm going to let you do all the actual calculations on your own, but what we have to do is set up our equations. So we know that during the 40 regular hours, he gets paid $15.77 per hour. So I'm going to figure out what his regular hours are. I know that during the 5.25 hours of overtime during the week, he's going to be getting an overtime wage. So we need to figure out exactly how much that is. I also know that he's going to be getting 5.7 times another hourly wage. And we have to figure that out. So how do we figure that number out? Well, we go back to the same method we used for the other question. $15.77 an hour times 1.5 is going to give us an hourly wage. 15.77 times 2.5 is going to give us a different hourly wage. So what you've got to do is figure out what these numbers are by punching them into your calculator, and then you're going to toss them up into these blanks right here. Once you've figured out what these numbers are, you're going to add up all of the numbers in that column and you're going to figure it out. You're going to find out what the total amount of money that he works for, the total amount of money he's going to make if he works those hours this week. I'm going to be checking to see if you calculated that out at the start of class or on your own. It's going to be the first challenge when we get into class tomorrow. So go ahead and try and figure out the answer for question 11, and we are going to be working on page our homework check for next class is going to be page 85, 1 to 6. It actually spans a few different pages, but it starts on page 185. So try this on your own. See what number you wind up with for a total. And when we get to class, we're going to have a chance to work on this further. All right, see you in class.